But I'm really pleased to be here with you today, and very flattered that you would give me this opportunity to talk with what's obviously a very bright group of folks. Any opinions that I give here today, please recognize are mine. They're not my company. I'm not here speaking for Southern Company. Obviously, I've learned a few things and have opinions about them, but this is Mike Harreld, not Southern. When I think about how different it is today compared to when I graduated in 1967, it really reminds me of how dynamic and challenging your future will be. And I hope that you will embrace it and go for it with great gusto. I could spend the whole time we got here talking about how things were then versus now, but just a few to give you a flavor. Gas was 36 cents a gallon in 1967. The average family made about $8,000, and you could buy a real nice home for $25,000. All phones were connected to landlines. The only people talking on wireless was Dick Tracy in the comics. There was no internet, no emails, no CNN, no Fox, no ESPN. In fact, my wife says, "How did you survive back then?" I don't know, because I have to get my ESPN fix every day. Political parties had their differences back then, just as they do today, but everybody agreed about at least three things. No country would ever make cars to compete with America's big three automakers. The Cold War was a permanent fixture in world affairs. And real estate prices always go up. So much for conventional wisdom. I learned a lot about business and accounting when I was here at Mizzou. But what I want to talk to you about today was something that wasn't taught in the courses and didn't appear in the books that I read. And what I think we could call this is what I want to call it the pendulum principle. I don't think you'll find it in Professor Cunningham, Nicolai, or Bosley lecture notes, nor in any of the textbooks, and I'm for sure it's not part of generally accepted accounting principles, and they haven't written a FASB about it, Financial Accounting Standards Board opinion, yet. However, it is just as immutable as any law of physics. In many ways, the pendulum principle that I'm talking about today is Newton's law of motion as it's used in business, governance, and society. Newton's law of motion says, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The pendulum principle goes like this. In business, government, and society, the tendency is to move from one extreme to the other, sometimes quite rapidly. For instance, we all agree, if you've studied what was going on in Russia and behind the Iron Curtain, that communist society stifled creativity and put a straitjacket on entrepreneurial enterprise and markets. But here's where the pendulum principle comes into play. It says if regulation is bad, the fix isn't less regulation, it's no regulation, or as close to that as possible. The pendulum, and thus our society, does not have the ability to balance itself. And if you've studied Russia, we saw that. Okay? They went from just an absolute government control to let it happen. And we had basically gangsters running the streets, running all the businesses. But a little closer to home, things like in 1999, we had a law called the Glass-Steagall Act that had been passed during the Depression, which separated commercial banks from what were more unregulated investment banks. Commercial bank would be like your local national bank. Investment banks would be like Citicorp, Lehman Brothers, those kind. But Senator Phil Gramm said then, "We have learned that the government is not the answer. We have learned that we promote economic growth and we promote stability by having competition and freedom." So Glass-Steagall Act went away. And lately, even after the Fed has stepped in and subsidized the takeover of Bear Stearns by J.P. Morgan Chase, Christopher Cox, who's the chairman of the SEC, is saying that Bear qualified under the Fed's rules as well capitalized. Now think about that a minute. The government has had to ride in with $30 billion plus to save you, and he's saying his rules said that they were well capitalized. It's just possible that there was something wrong with those rules. But then you can look at it the other way. Milton Friedman, who is certainly one of the most influential economists of the last century, said that prosperity springs from markets left free of government interference. And he was famous for saying, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years there would be a shortage of sand. And Grover Norquist, who is on the all-name team, if nothing else, how about that for a name? He heads up Americans for Tax Reform. And he has famously said that he wants to shrink government down to the size where he can drown it in his bathtub. Now, I agree that government is too big in lots of cases and tries to do a lot of things that we would be better off if they were done by individuals in the private sector. But if we've learned nothing else from what's happened to our financial institutions over the last couple of months, we've got to realize this: a totally free market simply doesn't work. Balanced regulation is an essential part of the fabric of our American enterprise system. When you don't have good regulators and good regulations, it's like playing basketball without referees. As a lifelong basketball fan, I've yelled at more than a few zebras in my lifetime. But without them, the team with the biggest brutes would bash the other team into submission and win every game. Instead of hack a Shaq, Shaq would do the hacking, and it wouldn't be basketball. By the time the Fed stepped in with its bailout, and whatever Mr. Bernanke may call it, that's what it was, everybody involved said they had no choice, that failure to act would have led to, quote, a greater probability of widespread insolvencies, severe and protracted damage to the financial system, and ultimately to the economy as a whole. People like me and your parents who have pension funds, hopefully, that are invested in the market, that's the kind of stuff they were talking about. And that may be true. I think it is true that we needed to step in and fix it. But the other thing that's true is that if the rules, adequate rules, had been in place and the referees were paying attention, it never would have come to that. The taxpayers, you and me, are on the hook for $29 billion because of loosey-goosey rules that left the referees sucking wind instead of blowing their whistles. And that's very important. And it happens to us in ways we don't understand. Okay? When you issue more government debt, right now, that's okay because government debt, U.S. government debt, is considered AAA. But how much of that stuff can we issue and it stays AAA? And how much has that impacted the decline in the dollar? And why should you care? Go try to buy something made somewhere else in the world today with the dollar. You'll find you buy a whole lot less than you did 6 months ago. Okay? So everything like this means something to you. And you're going to be paying at least the interest on that debt for the rest of your life. What we need is strong, alert, balanced, empowered regulators who keep the party going but limit the number of drinks so that no one gets drunk. And that's an art. Okay? Sometimes I think we as a society have never stopped believing in the tooth fairy. We think we're so smart that no other country has a clue, that somehow we should always win, and that there really is such a thing as a free lunch and a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Our society seems to believe that shoddy products are okay and somebody's going to buy them. All you got to do is look at General Motors versus Toyota. And if you haven't looked at them lately, go get in Toyota and then get in a GM product. It's appalling the difference if you care about America. Further, we think that if you make those shoddy products overseas and then bring them over here and thus they're cheaper, they're even more attractive and easier to sell, so that's even better. We also think that prices, especially for stocks and houses, always go up. Right? Of course, they always go up. The other thing that's going on is that if you get a few people to believe and the media echo chamber starts repeating it often enough, it becomes a fact. Okay? One of the things that's happening to us is that we're all constantly exposed. As I walk around the building, you got CNN all over the place. Okay? Well, you have to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to be impacted by that. And if they just keep saying it, pretty soon it's got to be right, right? Those people are brilliant. They all went to Missouri and got PhDs, and they're always right. The other thing going on is we think instant gratification. That's good. We've got to have instant gratification. More credit. It's always good. It's always available. Don't worry about it. Borrow it. Pay it back later, and somehow we'll figure out how to do that. Another thing is don't worry about risk. Risk, if you screw it up, the punditocracy, which is a group of pundits who wield great political influence, some of us call them the talking heads, will tell us that somehow the conventional wisdom got it wrong because we screwed it up, and the government will ride in and fix it. Okay? They'll issue some more debt that you and I can pay for. Like I hope most of you, and I bet you do, I read constantly. I read many publications on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. But I think sometimes I get the most wisdom out of the comic pages. And he hadn't been around for a few years, so you all may not be old enough to remember Pogo. But he was this little cartoon character, and he would be looking at some of the goofy things going on, and he says, "We have met the enemy. It is us." And I think we fall guilty to that. We constantly fall in the same traps. We assume that whatever's happening right now will continue for as long as we can imagine. Okay? Just think about it. It's so easy to do that. What's going on today? How could it possibly be any different later? And at lunch today, I was telling some folks about the fellow, and I'm sorry I cannot remember his name, but he did a study in 1890, And that was when people got around on horseback. And the economy was growing, so we needed more horses. Horses are great, but if you've ever been around one, they leave a little stuff there that you got to clean up from time to time. And he did a calculation that in order to keep the economy growing, that by 1910 in New York City, horse manure would be up to the second-story windows. Okay? Very logical. He just didn't realize there was something called the automobile coming along. Okay? And in 1990, if you'd have told me you were going to look up something on the internet, I would have thought maybe you hadn't sobered up from last night's beer party. The other thing we think is if a little of something's good, well then by golly more is better. Okay? That's where you get in trouble on Friday night when you think that first beer tasted so good, I believe I'll have 5 or 6 more. So some other examples of the last few years. In 1997, we hadn't built any big power plants in several years, and there was a big heat wave, and there was a shortage of electricity in the peak periods, and some folks that were selling power, doing what's called energy trading, there was a spike in the price, and some of those traders, especially Enron, made a lot of money. Okay? All of a sudden, the world was in love with energy trading. Everybody came out of the woodwork saying, oh, this is the way you do it. And Enron was the new media darling. If you weren't with it and doing what Enron was doing, you were out of it. And for about the next 5 years, energy trading was magic. Enron was brilliant, and if you didn't do what they did, you just didn't get it. I was in England at the time, CFO of an electric utility that my company had bought in '95 when we decided to expand internationally. The subsidiary of ours that owned our company, along with a lot of other companies that were not part of Southern, quickly jumped into energy trading in a fit of what I call Enron envy. It was like, oh, they've got the magic answer. Let's get on with it. Meanwhile, I'm sitting over in England, and I had seen Enron overpay tremendously for a water company that we had looked at buying. I had personally led the purchase investigation, and I thought I had a pretty good idea of what it was worth, and they paid tremendously too much. We also were wondering about how they could proclaim great future profits from trading broadband when we were learning in our broadband business that there was the beginnings of a glut of capacity with broadband because of technological improvements. Everybody was learning to put more down the same line. Enron's coming out saying they're going to trade broadband and make millions of dollars. I'm sitting there thinking, maybe I don't understand this trading game, but how do you make money trading something when there's too much of it? And we puzzled over how they could afford to open their European energy trading office a few blocks from Buckingham Palace, the most expensive neighborhood in the most expensive city in the Western world. We opened our European energy trading office, and energy trading, you got to understand, is a low-margin business that needs low-cost support for its processing in the suburbs of Amsterdam in a very nondescript office building. We also wondered how they could go around claiming they were going to grow 20% a year forever in a business, electricity, that at most was growing about 4% a year. You know, I knew it had been a long time since I'd been at Mizzou, but I didn't think those numbers added up. And I wondered about how they could go around telling people there were no hard assets in their business when they were selling electricity, which is the most capital-intensive industry in our country. I joke when I give a new board of directors an indoctrination session, I tell them that if they look up the term capital-intensive, our picture's there. Okay? It costs a lot of money to build power plants. And I wondered, I was really puzzled about how they made record profits every quarter despite having several $billion invested in a power plant in India that wasn't producing any revenue. It was all caught up in some political stuff and wasn't working. Think about that. Billions of dollars invested in something giving you no revenue. We later learned that the power plant and the water company, as well as lots of other overpriced assets, had been pushed off the balance sheet into SPEs, S-P-E-S's, special purpose entities. They were abusing an accounting rule that had been designed for a very limited source, and they were using it in ways that it really wasn't intended to be. No one else, though, seemed to have these concerns. Everyone thought that Enron was the path to riches. You literally couldn't pick up a newspaper or a business publication that didn't have some story about how great Enron was. And that love was even fueled more by this new avant-garde accounting method called mark-to-market, where you could have an agreement to sell a strip of power, say 100 megawatts for the next 10 years, and you would record that as a current sale. On the books, it looks like lots of immediate income. Remember those accounting courses? You put revenue at the top, there's no cost, it falls right through to the bottom. But there wasn't going to be any cash until the power was actually provided. There's nothing wrong with mark-to-market accounting if it's applied correctly, say with a stock investor who buys and sells stock every day and buys with the intention of selling sometime soon. Obviously, the market price in that case is a very relevant item and needs to be booked as a gain or loss depending on what happens. What Enron had done to get SEC approval of their scheme was to show them a very narrow example of where they sold a power strip one day and delivered the power in a few weeks. Later, once they got that approval, they blew it up to where you could sell power strip for 20 years and book all the income today. Think about that. I've got an obligation to provide you water one a day for 20 years. I estimate the value of that and book it all today as income. Crazy. So they had lots of income, but no cash because nobody was going to pay me for the water until I actually put it in their hands. So they started doing many shenanigans to treat borrowed money as cash flow from operations. If you study any accounting, you know, the first thing you do is look at the income statement and see if they're making any money. And then secondly, you look at the cash flow statement to see if there's any cash coming in from operations. And so when there wasn't any cash coming in from operations, people would ask questions. So they got to, if you've created income, you got to create cash. That's a lot harder. So they had all kinds of little neat deals to do it. One of my favorites was the scheme they hatched to sell. They had some barges that were little mini power plants that they could move around from country to country and sell power out of them. They sold those to Merrill Lynch, not bothering to disclose a little side deal they had saying that if Merrill Lynch couldn't sell them on to somebody else in 9 months, they'd buy them back, which is called debt. Okay? It was another way that they called it something else, cash flow, when it was really debt. One of the things you need to get in your head, you know, all kinds of cute tricks out there, but if you got to pay the money back, it's debt. Okay? It's very simple. Sounds simple, but people will dress that pig up with all kinds of lipstick and try to call it something else. With all this creative trading and sleight of hand accounting, Enron was showing increased earnings every quarter. But to keep that happening required more and more of these trades. Because if you had one of those trades in the first quarter, you booked all the profit. So you had to do another one the next time, which became more and more difficult to do. And as I watched all this going on, and of course they weren't the only ones doing it, lots of other folks were trying to do it, You know, and I went back to my accounting days at Mizzou, and I thought this accounting was fundamentally wrong. But I was told basically that I had no choice, that it was generally accepted accounting principles, and that I was just old-fashioned and I wasn't with it. This same mark-to-market accounting is contributing to our current mortgage meltdown as credit has tightened. Talk about a pendulum that has swung big time. If I'd been standing here a year ago, I would tell you that credit was, according to the market, virtually unlimited. You can't borrow money now to do anything. But as that's tightened so much and they try to value some of these securities that they've got out there, they really cannot be valued in the short run, because the market is so messed up that nobody's buying it, and when nobody's buying it, there isn't a market. But the auditors, remember the peekaboo, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, and all the grief they've been through, they're running in and hammering and saying, you got to record all this stuff at mark to market. And so people with these securities are saying, what do I do? And so they're being forced to take more and more write-downs, and every time they take a write-down, I think that lowers the market, at least the perceived market, even more. So it's one of these pendulums that so far hasn't stopped. Going back to the Enron glory years, this pendulum had really started when the Iron Curtain came down in 1989, and people saw behind the Iron Curtain how bad communism and excessive government was. And I can tell you, I was in with the former East Germany in 99 and 2000, 10 years later, and parts of it that hadn't been rebuilt were incredibly awful. So it was very, very bad. Communism, we got a lot of problems, but capitalism beats the living bejesus out of communism. It does not work. So take that one home and make sure you remember it, because somebody will bring it up again before your lifetime's over. But this media-fueled pendulum then took off, that if excessive government was bad, then less government was better, and even less regulation would be wonderful. And anybody who got in the way of that pendulum was literally blown away. We started in the early 90s, and it was a period of get the government out of Dodge. The SEC from time to time tried to step in and warn of accounting abuses and tried to pull the accounting firms in. The accounting firms went to Congress, and Congress bashed the SEC. The IRS tried to question some of the accounting abuses going on. Congress cut their budget. It was very old-fashioned to require companies to live up to standards. And the few voices that tried to say, wait a minute, in the past we've found, were drowned out. And these are very dangerous words to write down and remember when somebody tells you this. This time is different. All those bad things that happened before, this time is different because of such and such and such and such. In your career, you got a lot of great things coming, and they reward you for fresh thinking, and I encourage you to do that. But be careful when that thinking starts running against standards of behavior that you've been taught, because it's easy to step over that line, and it's pretty hard to get back on the other side of the line. This less regulation and no rules mantra went all the way to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. If you remember the 90s, if you weren't into earphones and what your girlfriend was doing or whatever. In the White House even, interns became fair game, remember? And the nation debated about what is. Okay? You know you're in trouble, and I vote sometimes Democratic and sometimes Republican, but when somebody tells you that they smoked marijuana but they didn't inhale, okay, that's a real test there, okay? I was telling the group that I talked to before this, integrity is the most important thing we got. and nobody smokes marijuana and doesn't inhale. And we had the news media writing stories. I'm not making this up, okay? Does character really matter? Okay? Think about that a minute. If I told Dale I was going to be here today at 3:30, can he believe that or not? Okay? Our whole society, our structure, our human relationships are based on what kind of character, what kind of person are you? You're going to be asked that your whole life. Not only you, but they're going to ask him, what kind of person are you? And if you screw that reputation up, you're out of here. You don't get many chances. In the energy trading business, they were having a big time while this was going on, but it wasn't sexy enough, so the traders started trading with each other. I sell you some power, you sell me some power, which created lots of revenue, round trips they called it. But since we were selling to each other, neither one of us wanted to lose or make money, no money was made. So guess what was then the mantra for a while was, revenue is what's important. Profit doesn't really matter. Okay? And this was all presented in ways where people believed it. Okay? Rating agencies bought into it big time. There have been at least 3 times in my career where the rating agencies were so far off the bridge that if there'd been sharks in the water, they'd have been eaten. Okay? So watch out when groups like that start telling you things are okay. Everybody was borrowing money to the maximum, and just as long as they could stay right on the edge of investment grade. And the only reason they cared about investment grade was that in order to trade with each other, they needed to have investment grade. And they were all trying to build more power plants so there'd be more energy so we could do more trades. And guess what happened? All of a sudden there was too much capacity. And if there's too many of these bottles of water, the guy selling them, what's he going to do? The price has to go down, right? So guess what happened in this case? Prices dropped. Enron's bubble burst. The rating agencies knee-jerked, and that line that was right here for investment grade suddenly was over here, and everybody fell off and became junk. The Justice Department indicted Arthur Anderson to deflect attention from George W.'s past affiliation with Kenny Boy. You remember Kenny Boy, who was the head of Enron. He had been one of George W.'s bosom buddies. The media loved that. They had to get some way for that to be back page news. The Justice Department had been arguing with the SEC about some of Anderson's activities and wanted to indict them, but the SEC had said no. The White House said, we got to do something, go indict Arthur Anderson. Congress rushes to the scene. Whenever one of these things, when the bubble bursts, the media will be there and Congress will be riding in to fix it. And that's when you really want to be under the table, because the fix will be really bad. They created the PCAOB, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, to hammer the accounting firms. Now, the accounting firms had gotten out of line, but again, the fix was we went to the other wall. And then they passed Sarbanes-Oxley, which was well-intended, but was a real disaster in terms of cost. It cost 3 or 4 times the value that it provided. So the pendulum hit the wall. Okay. One of the things to remember, the vote to go to war in Vietnam was 99-1 for it. Okay. Whenever I hear Congress is more, when they pass something, I want them to be about 52-48. That means they've really argued and hopefully fixed some of the invariable problems with whatever we do. There was a similar story happening at the same time with the telephone companies. All this wireless stuff was happening and everybody was jumping into that, and telephone companies went off the chart and then crashed. And then you remember another group called the dot-com companies. Same thing. There was a period of time where if you had .com in your name, you were a hero. And then all of a sudden everybody realized that it was a lot of vaporware. And that came crashing back to earth. It was so bad about 98, 99 that our CEO joked that we were going to change our name to Southern.com. Okay? Because that was right then, man. If you had .com in your name, you were the greatest thing since sliced bread. So as a result of all that crashing and burning, there was blood in the streets. If you own .com companies, energy trading companies, telephone companies, you lost tons of money. The stock market was struggling, so we had to find a new game. People looked around, and guess what was doing pretty good at that time? Real estate. Okay? Good old real estate. So everybody jumped on that bandwagon. And if a little is good, remember what we always do, if a little bit's good, more has got to be better, right? George W. pronounces the federal government's philosophy is everybody will be a homeowner. Okay? When somebody says something like that, watch out. Everybody can't be a homeowner. It doesn't work that way. Okay? Yeah, we want a lot of people to own homes, but it doesn't work that way. Okay? Fannie and Freddie, you heard about those characters? And the Fed all joined in encouraging people to buy houses. After all, come on, land's limited. Prices always go up. Besides, every purchase creates fees. Okay? Banks love them. Appraisers get paid. Lawyers get paid. Real estate agents get paid. Mortgage services people get paid. Investment banks get paid, and they can create more packages. This is great stuff. What do you mean? Watch out. Just get out of the way and let the party roll. And when buyers for the mortgages got a little scarce, we've got to do something about that. So they created mortgage packages called SIVs. Does that sound anything close to SPEs that we had before? SIVs, special investment vehicles. And your broker called you up and said, this is a great deal. Everybody's buying houses. They always pay off their mortgages. And besides, if they can't pay off their mortgage, you can sell the house. The price always goes up. So investors run out and borrow more money so they can buy these packages. And after they get a little suspicious and they don't want to buy any more, the investment banks say, well, no problem. We'll hold the paper ourselves. And so Citicorp's balance sheet and Merrill Lynch balance sheet and UBS balance sheet just gets fat and heavy with these things. Okay? And as home buyers, you know, after a while it's hard to find somebody that's not living in a home. I had a buddy doing the apartment business in Atlanta, damn near went belly up because everybody was moving out of apartments and buying houses. There are literally stories been documented where house cleaners making $30,000 a year are suddenly eligible for $400,000 plus loans. Okay? No worry if they can't make the payment. Now remember, prices are going to go up so they can sell the house. Down payments, you know, those things on a house, that's a drag. You know, you actually got to go out and do some work and save some money to buy a house. If you got to make a down payment, that's a drag. Get rid of that requirement. Who ever thought up that silly rule? Okay? And don't worry about bad credit loans. We'll take these packages and we'll sprinkle a few in this package and a few in this package and a few in this package. And nobody will know. It's all okay. Okay? The rating agencies, Congress, the media, and all the new homeowners loved it. Okay? Nobody was blinking when somebody would literally go buy a house for $800,000, borrow all the money at variable interest rates, and make no principal payments. I'm at a picnic about 18 months ago, and one of my neighbors, I didn't ask him, he just brags to me that his home value is going up more monthly than his interest payment. So he, in his terms, is living in his house and has two others that he's bought that way in other cities, and it's all free. Okay? No down payments, no principal payments, just pay the relatively low interest and enjoy the ride. Okay. The house in my neighborhood has been for sale now for over a year. I understand from a mutual friend that the other two that he had are also for sale, plus one other that he bought when he was transferred to another town. During this period, I read a story in the Wall Street Journal about flipping. And they had found people all over the world were buying Florida condos they had never seen, other than they were looking at something on the internet, on credit. They weren't putting any money down. They were just buying them on credit with no intention of ever being in Florida, let alone living there. Great deal. You buy this thing, borrow some money, price goes up. A month later, you sell it, pocket $10,000, go do it again. There isn't any risk. That's another time when somebody tells you there's no risk, grab your wallet and run out the back door as fast as you can run. Okay? The investment banks are so drunk on their fees at this point that they start selling these mortgages to each other so they can make even more money. And you know, all this takes a lot of work to package this stuff and sell it, so they need more people to do it. So they transfer the people out of the risk department, because after all, why would you need people in the risk department when there is no risk? And they put them over here working, selling these packages to each other. Okay? It's a great deal. Okay? And you remember Chuck Prince about 9 months ago? They issued quarterly earnings, and they asked him, was there any problems? He said, we're going to keep on dancing. Whoo, whoo. Okay? All of a sudden, the party hit the wall, and the Kool-Aid drinkers have a huge hangover. The media has loved every minute of it. They loved the party, and now they love the pendulum coming crashing back the other way because they got something to talk about. Okay? And they're hoping for at least an explosion a week, and so far they've been close to getting it. Preferably they want lots of suffering people in the streets foreclosed on by the evil investment banks. The old saying in newsrooms tends to be, if it bleeds, it leads. Okay? Which means that if it's a murder or a fatal car wreck, that's the lead story. Everybody wants to hear the gory details. But in this case, the blood is flowing from Wall Street to Main Street to one-time homeowners who have suddenly found themselves belly up, bankrupt. Again, guess what's happening? Congress is rushing to the rescue. Sound familiar? Again, watch out, because you and I are going to get left with what's happening. Credit is now kaput. Write-downs are going crazy. Companies like Countrywide are about to go belly up. Thousands of home builders are belly up. Bear Stearns is history. So what's going on with all this stuff? Okay, I mean, and here's my opinion: the concept of balance has been forgotten. Okay? And you got to understand, the media hates balance. Okay, it is boring. Okay. Nobody's going to write up that you went to school today and that you're a bright, young, good-looking person, well-dressed, learning for a prosperous future career. Who wants to write about that boring stuff? It's not newsworthy. And just think about a minute if a presidential candidate campaigned for balance. Or even worse, if they said we ought to get together and compromise. Okay? I don't think they'd get out of the primaries. Right now, the polls show that 3/4 of us in the country think the country is going in the wrong direction. So guess what the politicians are all saying? We should change. You know, that was real hard to figure out. If 3/4 of us say we're going in the wrong direction, we should change. Listen real closely, though, and see when they tell you about change to what. That's what we need, is somebody talking about, here's the issue and here's what I think we should do about it, and then force people to really get in front of us. In the middle of the last century, there was a philosopher named Walter Lippmann, and he was famous for saying, a nation divided irreconcilably on principle, each party believing itself to be absolutely correct and the other side absolutely wrong, cannot govern itself. Listen to the talking heads, our chattering class, and you'll quickly realize one of our big problems today is the far right against the far left. And apparently, never the twain will meet. When I was sitting where you are, the philosophy was more that politics was the art of the possible. Okay? And for instance, one of the things that's changed, which everybody thought was going to be such a great thing, and I think has led to a lot of our problems, when I was sitting where you were, they got the right, all the people who were the powers to be in a room, and they chose the presidential candidates. The media hated it. You know why? They didn't let them in the room. So they thought, they said the people are being excluded. Now, if you think about it, that wasn't really right. All the powers to be were sent by the people from the various states, okay? If they got in the room and they hammered out, they said, you know, he'd be a good candidate, but he's got these problems. She'd be good, but she's got these problems, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, they hammered it out and they picked the one that was the most acceptable. So they said, oh, no, that's not the way to do it. That's smoke-filled, backroom, evil stuff. So we're going to have primaries. Let the people speak. Great idea, right? I thought it sounded pretty good at the time, and I realize now what's happened is, what happens now, to run as a Republican, you have got to go appeal to the far left, or excuse me, the far right, and the Democrat to far left. So instead of getting two people who are somewhere in the middle of where most of us, 80+% of us are somewhere here, we get somebody relatively over here and somebody relatively over here, and we go into the polling booth, I think most of us, and we say, ooh, I don't like either one of these cowboys, but I'll vote for this one or this one because they're a little less bad. Okay? So I think that's what's going on, because we've screwed up the balance. And let's face it, you know, getting balance, especially when everyone is drunk on the high of the latest pendulum, is hard, if not impossible. Mr. Ethan Penner wrote an article in last Friday's Wall Street Journal where he pointed out aptly that nobody was calling their congressman complaining during the last bubble on houses that the prices were going too high. Okay? Everybody's drunk. They love it. Who's going to complain? So who's going to, if you don't have good, empowered regulators who have been set up to begin with to keep the party on the straight and narrow, it ain't going to happen. I don't often quote Ben Stein. He writes in the New York Times. He's been in a lot of different things, actor, game show host. He's always very conservative. But he had a very interesting article recently in the New York Times that I think captures what's going on, but also has got a great lesson for all of us. And this is a quote. Humans are seemingly wired to believe that they really can get something for nothing. And they pay the price for that over and over again. They especially do so if they are lending and investing with other people's money. And if there are short-term incentives for them to hop onto the gravy train. In the long run, they can always move on to the next scam. But something else has been missing here. Since the era of Ronald Reagan, we have been told by powerful groups that regulation is bad and that our economy will grow like magic if we'll just take regulation away. So regulation was removed from the savings and loans, and they were looted mercilessly. The Glass-Steagall Act was repealed so that large commercial banks could get into selling investments, and we got the near ruin of immense banks. And regulation of the mortgage-based securities was confined to a boilerplate that says everything and means nothing. And the cheerleaders in Washington say, now we need even less regulation. Still quoting, is anyone ever going to wake up to the fact that there's a lot of larceny in the human heart, and that there's a lot of sheep waiting to be shorn, and that regulation is not necessarily a bad thing? Or will we just lurch from massive meltdown to massive theft and on and on? Is anyone ever going to get it? Anyone? Anyone. End quote. I think that's a very powerful and accurate statement about our society today. Other pendulums that are currently rocking and rolling. The knee-jerk reaction to climate change. Okay? That's a pendulum that's often moving. One that's about to happen as soon as the election is over is the clamor for universal health care. Neither one of those, I'm not saying we shouldn't try to deal with them, but the problem will be that we will deal with them in a manner where the pain and agony and suffering and cost is about 10 times more than it needs to be, because we will not do it in a balanced, thoughtful, rational way. What is needed is balance. Too much government is obviously wrong and creates problems, but so will not enough. In every case I've talked about here today, energy trading, telecoms, dot-coms, subprime mortgages, it's easy to see what happened. And it was obvious at the time, but nobody wanted to look. And now we've got another problem, in addition to understanding what I just told you and getting people to deal with it, is even if we can get them to see that need for a more balanced approach, designing future systems at work is going to be even more difficult, because now the economy is global and is becoming more and more so every day. So even if we fix the United States, quote unquote, fix perfectly, it's not going to be an adequate response, because we are now becoming just one of many powerful entities. Bethany McLean, in the April 14th issue of Fortune, points out something that I think is very true. She says that broad principle-based approaches for both accounting and regulation would work better and cost less than the way we try to do all of our detailed rules and trying to control everything and driving ourselves crazy from one side to the other. But she makes a key point that I think is very important. But living according to principles, and remember that means as opposed to detailed rules, requires a certain maturity and a long-term view of where one's self-interest lies, something we seem to be incapable of. I think that's a pretty powerful message. And so I think I would leave you with this. Life has no magic, simple answers, even though, as several people, including me, have pointed out in here, we all think they're somewhere there. Okay? And surely, if we haven't found them yet, they must be in the next great thing, the solution du jour. Okay? But I think the truth is a little different. I think one of the things that you need to realize, if you don't, is that you are very fortunate people, as I am and have been as I live my life. We live in a society that has more choices and offers more to individuals than any society currently in the world or in the history of the world. And that's the good news. We have many, many choices. The price for that, though, is that we have to choose daily as individuals and as a society where we're going to be on this very large balance beam. You don't have to like it, but you're on one. Okay? And almost always being on one end of that balance beam or the other is wrong. Making sure you're where you should be on that beam requires daily choices. and the awareness that yesterday's choice, no matter how good it was, is not necessarily the right choice for today. So what can we do as individuals? I've thought about this some, and here's what I try to do, and I think this might help you. Understand this pendulum process. Chances are it's not going to change a whole lot in your lifetime. And that's usually what's going on. So you want to try to figure those out and use them. You know, if you can get in front of one of those pendulums, you can make a ton of money. Just get off before it crashes the wall. Okay? Something you've got to come to grips with. We don't like this, we know it, but we forget it, and we don't want to think about it. But you got to remember that people are greedy, and they will lie, cheat, and steal. Okay? We've got to have good control systems. We've got to remove temptation. People are fallible. Be very wary when the justification of whatever it is because everyone is doing it. Okay? If that's the justification for doing something, you need to re-examine your values. Watch out when you hear, this time it's different. Okay? Every one of these were challenged by people along the way, and every time they were said, oh, you're wrong. This time it's different. Business cycles fed by our exuberance and pendulums exist and will happen. So here's what I would leave you with. Focus on whether real value is being created. Okay? My daddy, when I first went to work for the A&P grocery store, the first day I went down and I worked 6 hours or something, and I got paid $3 or whatever the rate was, and I came home and that night, and he said, son, how much did they pay you today? And you know, teenage, I said, oh God, here he goes again. And I said, $18. And he said, well, did you provide more value than that? And I looked at him, you know, like you do at your father when you're 17 years old, that you're sure he's gone to Mars and lost his mind. But I went in the other room and I thought about it, and that's really bottom line. You know, when you get out here and go to work, I'm going to offer you a job, paying you some amount of money. My belief, if I'm going to do that, is I've got to believe I'm going to get more out of you than that, or I ain't going to do it. So if there's not value in the proposition, you don't want to go there. Secondly, ask yourself if real equity is being created, or is this a debt game? Remember what I said about debt? It's got to be paid back. Okay? There's a huge difference that you learned in accounting, but maybe you haven't learned it in the real world yet, between equity and debt. And so you want to look for businesses to do business with, to work for, to invest in, that have balance, and they have consistency, and they have regulators that are the same way. Regulators are good if they do their job right. Nobody likes to watch basketball games that don't have good basketball referees. Also, realize that short-term incentives usually encourage excess. Okay? And that incentives really should be tied to long-term, verifiable success. And above all, I'll leave you with this. Recognize the Tanstaffel principle. Tanstaffel, T-A-N-S-T-A-A-F-L. And that stands for, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So, thank you. Sure, absolutely.
I have time for just a couple questions. Anyone like to address anything? Yes, sir. Tom.
What's your view of the outlook on atomic energy as the power production in the United States?
Okay, the question is atomic energy for the United States. I think it's clearly part of the answer. Obviously, after talking about it for however long, balance is a key part of it, I think. Right now, there's 3 ways to make energy in the quantity we need: gas, coal, and nuclear. Basically, you make electricity by having heat that boils water that turns the turbine. Okay? And so nuclear is clearly a way to do that, and it is a good way. It costs a bunch of money on the front end to get it built and do it right. So you only want to do it for the plants that you need almost all the time. Base load plants, we call them. But clearly it is part of the answer. We have not built one in this country for 20 years. There is action now encouraged by the government to move in that direction. So people are looking at it. I think clearly it is part of the answer. It has got its challenges up front, hugely expensive. You've got to make sure you get it built right. You've got to have regulators with you, and that's very important. The one issue that has not been solved yet, it's not as big as the media wants to make it, but it is important, and that is, what do we do with the spent fuel? Most of the world reprocesses the spent fuel into new fuel, and that reduces it from a fairly, it's really not that big. I've been told that you could put on one football field about 6 feet high all the spent nuclear fuel made from utility energy production in this country. So it's not like it's miles of it, but it's very radioactive. But if you reprocess that, you could reduce that by probably a factor of 20. Until we decide to reprocess, we have to have some way to deal with the spent fuel. Right now, it's being put in iron casks and stored at each site. That's not a bad answer, but we got 105 of them around the country. I'll be around if somebody wants to ask a question. I hope this was useful. I enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for your attention.
Let me thank you as well.
Okay.
We have, of course,
Oh, thank you.
plaque from
Okay.
Robert J. Trulaske, Senior College of Business, University of Missouri, in appreciation for C.B. Mike Harreld, the Vaughan Executive Residence Lecture.
Well, thank you very
Of
much.
course,
I appreciate it.
We have great expectations. We have quite a few starters coming back. We expect that the Mizzou gear is going to be in high
Absolutely.
demand coming
Right.
the fall. So we'd like to take that as
Great. Well, thank you very
Thank you very
much.
much.
Great.